Fiscal Commission, modeled on a proposal by Republican Judd Gregg and Democrat Ken Conrad.
And you heard it. That's the President Obama. He gave our next guest a shout-out during the State of the Union last week. But party lines are now being drawn as Republicans await to see the details. The President's 2011 budget. Joining us now, Senator Judd Gregg, ranking member of the Budget Committee. And you were sitting there going, not true. It's not true. that was your...
I'm not in that branch of the government, actually.
Oh, that wasn't you. That wasn't you.
Although he could be.
Yeah, he could have been, exactly. Judd, $3.8 trillion, $1.6 trillion shortfall. Was there really anything discretionary that you could do about it this year? I mean, how would you, what would you have done?
Yes, there is.
There is what?
Well, I believe genuinely that you've got to step up on the spending side of the ledger. You know, I think it was Einstein who said that the definition of insanity is doing the wrong thing over and over again and expecting change. And the wrong thing is basically growing the government, spending a lot of money and adding to the debt. And we've got to change that. My suggestion would be that instead of doing this health care bill in its present form, that you go back to the health care bill and take a look at some of the elements of it. In that bill, there was $500 billion of reductions in Medicare spending, which was used to fund new entitlements, in other words, used to grow the government. Instead of doing that, why don't we take that $500 billion and put it into a Medicare insurance or rescue fund so that we use it to basically make Medicare more solvent? That would immediately adjust the deficit by significant numbers over the next 10 years. In addition, this freeze should be a hard freeze, and it should apply, in my opinion, not only to the non-defense discretionary starting in 2011, it should start today. And you ought to also probably reduce it by the amount of earmarks, you know, do a freeze, less earmarks. There are things that can be done that are real. And if we don't start doing things that are real, we're going to get ourselves into deep, deep trouble here, and we're going to continue to pursue this course of fiscal insanity, in my opinion.
But in the real world, who's going to vote for any of these things? Would you have to wait till November to do that?
No, you should do it now. I mean, I think the American people have caught up with this. That's what Massachusetts, I think, was about. The American people are really worried and concerned. And what they're most worried about, I believe, is that the government has grown so much and our debt has gotten so large that we're passing on to our children a country they can't afford. And we're going to give our children a less prosperous country than we received, which is unacceptable. Unacceptable to all Americans, because that's not the American dream. You always pass a better nation on to your kids, not a nation that has less prosperity. And so I think the American people are ready for us to step up and do some very aggressive and difficult things in the area of restraining spending, because they get it. You know, I mean, almost every American as a result of this recession has been through some sort of belt tightening in their home. And yet they look at the federal government and they watch it just being profligate. I mean, it's not just this year, which is the issue of stimulus. It's next year, the year after, the year after, the year after. 8 years out, the president is projecting a $1 trillion deficit. $1 trillion every year for the next 8 years. That's not acceptable. You just can't do that to this country, because you're basically taking us down the road of insolvency. We're going to end up like some South American, you know, banana republic.
Senator, would you even try to sell politically a freeze on military spending, putting a hold on the Pentagon?
Well, you know, the first obligation of a nation is to defend itself, and we have armies in the field. So we have to do whatever we need to do in order to make sure they have the support they need. Reorganizing the defense spending? Absolutely. You know, there's some weapon systems that are strategic in nature that we probably should pass up buying right now. We can probably tighten our belts on the defense side. But in the end, if you've got armies in the field, you're going to have to spend whatever it takes to make sure those troops have the support they need.
Judge, Jim Nussle here. I can't help but look at the numbers and realize that for one of the first times in history, Congress shows up to work for this year, and because all of the money that we send in tax dollars is already spent on the mandatory programs, the $1.45 trillion the president wants to spend on discretionary spending is all going to need to be borrowed. Every single penny of what you and my former colleagues had to do over the next year basically has to be borrowed. What's that going to do to the Congress this year as you consider some of the big issues ahead of you?
Well, that's not only true, Jim, but we have to borrow the money to pay the interest. Can you imagine that? We're borrowing to pay our interest payments. I mean, if that's not the definition of insolvency, I don't know what is. Well, it should put a lot of pressure on us to be much more disciplined in our spending. And I heard one of the guests, it might have been Steve Leishman, actually say that really this is both a tax and a spend issue. If you look at the numbers, that really isn't true. CBO is saying that tax revenues will get up to about 20% of GDP, which will be above the historic norm of about 18%. But what they're also saying is that spending will go from 20% of GDP, which is the historic norm, up to 20, it is at 25% now, and then up to 30% of GDP. This truly is a spending issue. The government is simply being grown too fast and in a way that we cannot afford. And that's because, whether you like it or not, we're functioning with a Congress which genuinely believes that if you grow the government dramatically, you create prosperity. I fundamentally disagree with that. You do not create prosperity by growing the government faster than your economy can afford it. The way you create prosperity is by giving people the incentive to go out and take risks and invest and create jobs. And we've got to change our attitude around here, or else we're just going to basically put so much debt on the books that we can't catch our tail.
So if we're really serious about this, why isn't taxing part of the solution?
Well, actually, there's $2 trillion of taxes in the president's proposal. $2 trillion. And so the point is the tax revenues are going to get to a level that is way above what we've historically taken in as a nation. As I mentioned, CBO projects it to be around 20%. The problem isn't that we're not raising enough in revenue. The problem is that we're spending so much more than we historically spend, and we're spending much more than we can afford.
Yeah, and then you saw the big pivot to jobs now, Judd, and I tried to count up how many different businesses that have been kind of assaulted, or at least perceived to have been assaulted. And then I think jobs, businesses. It seems impossible to talk out of one side of your mouth about jobs and out of the other side of your mouth when you've bashed the travel industry, the banking industry, the oil and gas industry. You go right down the line. Healthcare industry, health insurance, the vilified. What jobs are left, or what industries are left to create the job?
Well, you got an excellent point, Joe. When you're trying to replicate a European form of government where the government steps in and essentially manages the economy at all sorts of levels, and where basically you've got massive overregulation and you have basically nationalization of certain industries like the student loan industry, and then you say, well, but you want the entrepreneurs to go out and take risks and create jobs and create capital. Well, entrepreneurs don't react that way, you know. When they see uncertainty in the marketplace as to whether or not they're going to get a return on their investment because they're afraid the government's going to come in and basically take most of their investment through either tax policy or regulatory policy, they don't take the risks and they don't make the capital investments. And that's just simple economics and simple common sense. And so if you've got a government in place that is basically has an inherent antipathy towards the market and capitalism, and I believe this government does. I wish it weren't true, but this is a government of community organizers who believe in social justice.
Green renewable.
And they don't.
This is a government you almost joined as Commerce Secretary.
Yeah, well, we all make mistakes, and that was certainly one of mine.
Renewable green energy is okay, I think. We got to get 100% jobs. Got to come from that.
Well, green energy is fine, but let's also talk nuclear energy, and I think the president's starting to do that. Yeah. But let's talk about creating energy and using energy supply which is American-made, such as natural gas.
Sooner or later, you're going to have to go as a partner with business, not as an adversary, if you're really serious about jobs. And I told you were on today. I didn't know if you were going to show up because I thought you were going to show up tomorrow. Get your calendar right, will you?
I thank you for the advice.
You're welcome. All right. Thank you, Senator.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks.
All right. Coming up, big oil kicks off February stocks to watch. Squawk Box will be right back.